Hi, and now we're into education. And in education, we're going to look at basically the definitions that are important and relative to education. So we'll begin with an overview of education, and then we're going to have a bit of a historical perspective of education, but we're not going to go into spending a lot of time on that. We will spend a fair bit of time looking at sociological perspectives about education. If you remember, essentially every week when we do a video, one of the things that I include are the sunglasses. So the different theorists and how they want to view the role of education in society. And then we're going to look at some of the current issues in education. Currently, these are dynamic and changing over time, so it would be kind of a thing that have been relatively current until now. We'll look at a little bit about where education may go in the future. Some of the things you might want to consider when thinking about the topic would be, how do race, class, gender affect people's access to or opportunities in education? Does it play a role at all? We may also want to consider, what are some of the key assumptions that functionalists, symbolic interactionalists, conflict theorists, feminists, and postmoderns, what do they think about it? What are the sort of perspectives on education? And then the last thing we'll consider is what major problems are being faced by Canadian schools today. Now, the topic is certainly pertinent in that you have all been through school. We've encouraged school, maybe private schools, maybe even homeschooling, and we're all finding ourselves in post-secondary looking for a career opportunity, perhaps continued education. And so education plays a dynamic role in society. And what it does teach us about society, content, and about job readiness, career opportunities, and the roles that we can play. However, in other cultures, education is probably considered, if you remember from previous lessons, that it's a number one life chance. Of all the things that can help somebody get up from wherever they are, whether it's in the part of the world where life is hard and difficult, education can and will make a difference. Though some of your research from your assignment, you may have recognized that some of the differences between income in countries and economic levels, and therefore also what they have available for themselves, how they are living. And you saw through the Dollar Street at the Gapminder site some of the pictures. Perhaps you could see how education is a life chance. It's one of those things, a number one thing, that if anybody has access to education, it has a huge impact on the overall society. In many lower income countries where education is given to women, it is the direct impact on the number of children they have. You'll see in this video where I've popped a couple of graphics to show you the sort of statistics, and you'll see that in your text. It gives them a number of big impact changes to their health of their children. It's education. You can give medication, you can give food for people to eat, but education gives them an opportunity to feed themselves, of course. It's one of the major institutions in society. It's one of the things that the big impact on people and family. Of all the societal institutions, education is probably one of the most important ones. I hope you enjoyed this topic. We're going to do this in one video, so it might be a bit long, so feel free to pause the video along the way and take some notes. We're going to look at the historical perspective, but let's just touch basically on the definition of education. Education is a social institution responsible for the systematic transmission of knowledge, skills, cultural values within a formal, organized manner. And so look at the definition there so it's systematic transmission. That just means, if you will, a way of giving in a very organized and a specific manner information regarding knowledge, so what knowledge, and skills, what skills, and cultural values, well, depending upon where you live, in a formally organized way. Well, we don't do it informally. Whenever you stop at Tim Hortons, you don't get educated. Well, you might. However, it's very formal. There are schools, and you go to school at certain times of the day for certain lengths of time, and you study certain things. And that is what education is in terms of our topic. Now, one of the things that introduced, and you heard it in the definition, social institution. Well, a social institution, it's one of many. Now you're seeing examples of some here. The economy is an institution, politics, family, education, religion, mass media. These are all examples of social institutions within any given society. And they are enduring. They've been around for a long time. They involve people in organized manners, whether it's hierarchical, as in, in some cases the economy or politics, even religion, even for that matter, education. But they've been, they influence the socialization, they influence society, and society influences them. And so these social institutions, and education is the one we're speaking about, are important, they're very powerful, and they have influencing forces in Canada. And so you might want to say, well, why? What is that? Well, they all involve, education involves imparting values, beliefs, and knowledge. A large part of what makes Canada Canada is not just the family we're raised in and what they teach us about what's important and our values and beliefs. That is important, and religion does that. Education does that as well. And sometimes our beliefs and values and knowledge that we get from education compete with the ones that we've learned from home or from religion. And so we use all of these things to help mold who we are. And so education doesn't only impart values, beliefs, and knowledge, it also allows us to grapple with some issues that, on the one hand, society needs to be stable, and on the other hand, social change moves society. And so education is a part of that stability, teaching us things that enable society to continue to be the way it is, and change, teaching us things that enables us to go out to be change makers. And both, education is a socializing element. We learn how to be little citizens when we are in public school. We learn to take turns. We learn we're not the only center of the earth in existence. When we're young, we begin to think that we're the only people and the family revolves around us. But it's not until we get to kindergarten and grade 1 that we start to recognize we are not the center of the universe and that other people are there. And so we learn how to take turns, how to make friends, and how to play well with others. So when we look at the historical perspective at a macro level, the social institution of education is an essential component in maintaining and perpetuating the culture of a society across generations. So one of the ways in which historically we've used education, whether it be done informally or formally, is to help perpetuate one's culture. Now that means one of the terms that we could start to introduce here would be cultural transmission. And this is the process by which children and recent immigrants become acquainted with the dominant culture's beliefs, values, norms, and accumulated knowledge of the society. It occurs through informal and formal education. So the formal education is school typically, the informal education is the lessons that we learn while we engage with people around us, our parents, our coaches, our friends. Now in pre-literate society, there was no written language. A very basic terminology and simple division of labor was at play. Daily activities often centered around the struggle to survive against natural forces. And the earliest forms of education were survival-oriented. Acquiring knowledge and skills through informal education, learning that what occurs is spontaneous and is oftentimes unplanned, was what education was in this pre-literate society. And then through direct informal education, parents and others provide information about how to gather food, find shelter, make tools, and get along with others. Now, if we take the opposing, the next stage, if you will, the more pre-industrial societies, well, they have a written language, but few people knew how to read and write. Formal education is often reserved for the privileged. Education becomes more formalized in pre-industrial and industrial society, where we started to emerge with what is known as formal education. Formal education is learning that takes place within an academic setting, such as a school, which has a planned instructional process, a curriculum, and teachers to convey this specific knowledge or skills or thinking to possess thinking processes to students. So as a society industrializes, the need for formal mass education increases significantly. So the more we become industrialized, the more we need to educate people on how to be prepared for what they need to participate in to keep that industrialization going. Jobs, skills, knowledge, values, and beliefs. Mass education, as an alternative term, refers to providing free public schooling for a wide segment of the nation's population. So one of the things that you may have heard of before in the online world is what's called MOOCs, MOOC. These were massive online education opportunities that were free, but they were also non-accredited. And so you had opportunities to get free education, if you will. It wouldn't enable you necessarily to get jobs, but it was mass education. In Canada, the school reformers of the late 1800s began to review education as essential to a country's economic growth. And so what we're going to move into, I'm dealing with a bit of a cold. We'll move into the sociological perspective. And we're going to start with the different theorists. We'll start with functionalism. Now, functionalists, their education is, for them, there's a function. I'm going to go back to the term, and oftentimes when you're thinking about any of the topics we talk about, and functionalists think function, purpose. And so part of what they're doing is education is crucial to the promotion of social solidarity and stability in society. That's from Durkheim. Moral education was also an important element to Durkheim, and the group needs to proceed with these individual needs. Now, from Durkheim's perspective, moral education takes on an added note. If you look in Ontario, 1994, the Royal Commission on Learning says that students should learn basic moral values such as a sense of caring and compassion, respect for the human person and anti-racism, a commitment to peace and nonviolence, honesty and justice. Now, a part of the functionalist perspective that this moral education would be a way of fine-tuning and maintaining a stable, healthy society. Now, some of the specific functions, when we go back to functionalists and function, is to ensure all students have a high level of literacy by building on basic reading, writing, and problem-solving skills. If you think about your education, what did you learn? To read, to write, and some problem-solving skills. That's one of the basic things you learn through public school. To develop an appreciation of learning, the wish to continue learning, and the ability to commit to do so. Now, you're all in post-secondary, so that was a checked off the list as far as functionalists would be concerned. And then to prepare students for responsible citizenship. And again, that's part of what we get out of our post-secondary education, along with what we've done through public school and high school. Now, one of the things that the functionalists introduced, aside from these sort of basic functions of education, were what are known as manifest and latent functions of education. Now, manifest functions are, openly stated. These are the intended goals of what we think that education will do. These are the anticipated consequences of these things that we're doing in education. That's manifest, deliberate, purposeful. Latent, on the other hand, these are more hidden, unstated, and sometimes really not intended consequences of the organization. So when we think in these sorts of terms, look at some examples, we can see that the manifest functions, the intended purpose of education is socialization, transmission, or the education of what our culture expects of young citizens, social control, learning about rules and abiding by them, social placement. This is more about, and we'll get into this in another sort of view within culture, within conflict, but looking at how does education help move us towards certain career choices based on our success rates or our interest rates in different areas of education. Plus, it's change and innovation. It's one of the intended purposes is to educate people to engage in society and to help improve in society. Now, the latent functions would be restricting some activities, matchmaking. We meet some of the people who will be lifelong friends, even potential partners, through education. It's not because that's the purpose, but it is what the outcome, because, well, you're following career choices that share interests, and one of the main success rates for successful couples is shared interests. And it creates a generation gap. It's not intended, but because of education we start to keep changing. We have older people who understand the world in one way and younger people who start to learn the world about it in another way. So let's move forward, and we'll go into conflict. Now, conflict theorists, as you remember, they view all society as on an unequal basis, and so there's an unequal distribution of resources. So here the theme in regards to education is schools often perpetuate this class, racial, ethnic, and gender inequalities, that there's some that have and that some that don't. And oftentimes these are drawn on the lines of class, lower class versus upper class, racial and ethnicity, or gender inequalities. Now, some of the elements is cultural capital and class reproduction. And so part of what's included here would be, education is a vehicle for reproducing existing class relationships. So how much money do you have? Do you have a home? What kind of home do you have? Children come from various backgrounds, and cultural capital, the social assets that include values, beliefs, attitudes, and competencies in language and culture. So this cultural capital becomes pretty important to conflict theorists in terms of what do you have to bring to the picture and how can you utilize it to your best advantage. Now, tracking and social inequality is another component or theme of the conflict theorists. Now, with tracking, this is what's happening here is the assignment of students to specific courses and educational programs based on their test scores, their previous grades, or both. The theory here is that lower grades will go more vocationally and higher grades will go college and university. Now, back in my high school period, there was two streams essentially. There was the general and the advanced. If you were in the advanced, you were doing a 5-year, grade 9 to grade 13, and then move right into university. And if you were in the general level, that stream was for more grade 9 to grade 12, and you were likely to be more vocational. Now, you could flip back and forth. It wasn't as easy, but that was an example of tracking. Now, some of the effects of this is it can improve or increase, if you will, the dropout rate in school, or it ends in dead-end situations where people end up following a path that doesn't really suit what their interests are. Now, the third point, and this is where I was touching base on it with functionalism, but the hidden curriculum. This is the transmission of cultural values and attitudes such as conformity and obedience to authority through implied demands found in the rules, routines, and regulations of schools. The class variations are present here. Now, the theory is if students do not learn these elements well, then they are less likely to succeed in society. So if we don't learn to conform and to be obedient to authority, then this affects our ability to succeed in society. And then this is the conflict theorist. Remember, this is an inequity. It's like looking at a balanced scale and seeing some people at the lighter end, the top, and others, the bulk of people at the bottom end. And so if those people in the bottom end aren't following obedience, aren't being conformist, then this is going to make society not be very successful. So part of this is what's known as credentialism. And this is where it's a process in which the class advantage and social statuses are linked to the possession of academic qualifications. So the more you can follow that tracking to the university and college, the more you get accreditations, credentials, if you will, that say this is what you've accomplished, and this enables you to follow a line of either high success or into more of a working for somebody else as opposed to being the employer. Gender bias becomes very obvious through this, a differential treatment for boys and girls in schools. Now, that's the conflict theory. Now, related to conflict, if you recall, is the feminist perspective. Now, it's had a very big impact on the education system. In the late 60s, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women examined gender bias and gender socialization. Girls were underrepresented in school books, or very stereotypical roles within those school books. It's a good practice just to go through some of your textbooks to see what is the representation of men and women in your textbooks. One, are there more men than women? And two, are the women or men in more traditional stereotypical roles than what you understand what men and women are capable of doing? Boys and girls were segregated in the playgrounds and in sporting activities. Teachers demonstrated stereotypical expectations for both males and females, or boys and girls, in their attitudes and in their interests. Now, the idea that biology didn't mean destiny, that was an important part of the feminist movement. That equality meant open access and equal treatment. By 2006, according to the census, 60% of university graduates are females. You can check this out on page 354, table 14.1. And that image there is really just related to the segregation that happens in schools, and certainly happened in the 60s, more so, and in some in the 70s. Now, looking at symbolic interactionalists, the theme here is the study of classroom communication patterns and educational practices such as labeling that affect students' self-concept and aspirations. And so important here is what is labeling and what is self-fulfilling prophecy. So labeling, it comes up in a number of different areas in sociology. The basis of labeling is those with power, in this case under education as teachers, often label certain students as slow, lazy, or smart, or a liar. And for some students, labeling amounts to a false self-fulfilling prophecy. Previously defined as an unsubstantial belief or prediction resulting in behavior that makes the originally false belief to be true. This is from Merton in sociology. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is that it's not coming through very well, I'm sorry. Others' beliefs, so if a teacher on the right-hand side has a belief that we're not okay, we have lied, and we're labeled a liar, then those beliefs will affect our reaction, which then reinforces the belief that we are in fact a liar, and it will influence our actions towards others by lying. And so symbolic interactionists look at this as being an important feature about education in terms of that role of the teacher. Research done that was a study reflected researchers who divided randomly students into two groups, exceptional group and the average group. The exceptional students in a post-test scored higher on IQ levels than were students who were labeled average. The influence on that success wasn't the students, because they were randomly selected, it was the teachers who were influenced the students and their grading. That it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now we're going to move on to postmodern. Now postmodern, they have an interesting perspective here. Universities are considered to be MIC universities. Can be thought of as a means of educational consumption that allows students to consume educational services and eventually attain goods such as degrees or credentials. So what are students shopping for? Well, they're shopping for convenient hours, no traffic jams, accessible and low-cost parking, short lines, polite and efficient personal services, yet they also want high quality for their low price. Characteristics of the postmodern university college would be inclusive with video games, ATMs, Olympic-sized swimming pools, high-tech classrooms. Will this university type become more and more surreal? Well, it's hard to know, and it's hard to know whether in fact this is the way, and yet you will find examples in education where post-secondary is moving more and more in that direction. Okay, so let's move toward the next stage, which is current issues. Now, these aren't all the current issues. These are just limited to the ones that your textbook is going to highlight. And so some of the ones that are highlighted are standards, looking at private or public school and which is better, and looking at disability issues. So when we think about inadequate standards, this is concerned about the adequacy of public schools, the overall that many families believe that private schools are better choice for their children because they are more academically demanding, more motivating, more focused on discipline, and without many of the inadequacies found in public schools. Now, however, according to some social analysis, there's little to substantiate the claim that private schools, other than the elite academies attended by the children of the wealthiest and most influential families, that they are not necessarily more inherently better than public schools. Now, these are particularly some of the issues in terms of improving the standards. You see the EQA standards, looking at math and language, English in particular, standards for grade 3, 6, and 9. We see some movement towards increasing the prospects of private schools, for-profit schools, and what does that do to the overall benefit to society? Does it improve it? Does it diminish it? Does it alter it? When we think in terms of students with disabilities, the barriers facing students with disabilities are slowly being removed or surmounted by new legislation. There was a legislation put in almost 15 years ago called the Accessibility Act, and it said that in 25 years, all public buildings needed to be accessible for people with disabilities, and we're drawing very close to where we need to have that in place by now. And that's new legislation 15 years ago. Today, most people with disabilities are no longer prevented from experiencing a full range of academic opportunities. And in fact, in post-secondary, having the appropriate documentation will allow you to have the accommodations required to be successful, essentially leveling the playing field, that no person because of disability should be unable to attend school. Today, more than 85% of the children with disabilities are integrated into mainstream schools. 15 years ago, more than 80% of these children were placed in segregated schools. So that's a huge improvement. This change reflects growing acceptance that children with disabilities often thrive in an integrated learning environment. Now I'm going to go through a couple of things that you'll find in your textbook, but I'll touch on them here as well. One would be looking at levels of earnings of education. This was in 2005, and there are certainly more current data, but the trend has been moving more and more in this direction. The higher your education level, the more money that you can potentially make. So the post-secondary education has been described as a dividing line of modern labor market that for most Canadians, higher education will result in higher earnings. However, in order to obtain a university education, students must have the necessary financial resources. Between 1991 and 2010, the average tuition fees for undergraduate graduate degrees went from approximately $1,500 to over $5,000. Close to 30% of students surveyed anticipated debt over $10,000 once their education was completed. When I attended university at Wilfrid Laurier in 1975, I paid $874 for tuition to go to university. You can see how things have certainly changed over the years. This is showing you the differences in the tuition fees from, you see the increase in tuition from 1991 through to 2004, 2005. It's matched against the tuition, the consumer price index. The last thing I want to touch on is just the future of education. The rising component of homeschooling. More people have chosen to homeschool their children. In fact, I've had many students come through my classes who themselves have been homeschooled. And so what does that impact on the educational system? School enrollments will continue to grow. We've gone through a lull of the baby boomers and the number of children after that period of time having reduced. So many of the schools that were opened in the 60s have started to close, because that has not happened. Now we're starting to see a slight upturn of school enrollment growing because more kids are being born. Need to make education more accessible to the disadvantaged person. Now, I think it was just, was it 6 months ago that kids wanting to go to post-secondary will get a significant reduction, or is it free? I can't recall. I'm sorry, I might be misspeaking. In terms of their post-secondary education based on their parents' income below a certain level, and I've forgotten what that number is. It could be 40,000 or 50,000. And with a rise of tuition at the post-secondary level, it may mean that many students in the future will be locked out, won't have that opportunity. And so we, as a society, need to do what we can to make that improvement, because as we've mentioned before, as I mentioned on the introduction, that education is the number one life chance. If you have the chance, seize the chance. Be successful. Know what you want from your education, because it leads you towards a career, and focus on being successful in your education, because that will enable you to be successful in your career. I hope this has been useful. I hope it's been helpful. Keep up the good work, and we are almost there, everybody. Carry on.